So it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speaker this morning, who's the Rev Dr Ann Peart, who will be looking at theology from women's experience. I will look at Unitarian women's engagement with issues of theology and gender, considering why these remain important. Anne is a former principal at Unitarian College Manchester and has held various ministries in London and Manchester, and she's written and researched widely.
When I was first asked to talk on feminist theology from a Unitarian perspective, I said yes, and only afterwards thought about the current state of feminist theology, which seemed to be fading fast from both the academic scene and more popular parlance. Some of this is to do with the deconstruction of both feminist and particularly of the category woman. So when I suggested the title Theology from Women's Experience, I was casting myself as an old-fashioned second-wave feminist. And later in this paper, I will address the problem of the apparently disappearing woman. So for the first part of my talk, please indulge me and let me assume that the human categories of man, meaning the male gender, and woman still have at least some validity. Although in part of my talk, I will be using man in the 18th and early 19th century sense of meaning all humans, but I will point that out at the time. It may be helpful to start by unpacking what is meant by feminist theology. Several books on the subject devote many pages to exploring possible meanings. One short definition from an online source may be enough here. It claims that feminist theology examines the history, beliefs, and practices of religious traditions from feminist perspectives. But feminist perspectives needs further unpacking. By feminist, I mean not just from women's experience, but with the insights of a consciousness of the ways in which patriarchal societies have been and are denying justice and voice to women. Perspectives is in the plural because there are different contexts in which this injustice is perpetrated. Feminist theologians have been increasingly reticent about definitions and indeed have problematized much of the earlier work in this area, and I shall return to that. The description of theology as the examination of the history, beliefs, and practices of religious traditions is intentionally a very broad one, implying a multidisciplinary approach. And I hope that it is one which is in sympathy with Unitarian ways of doing things. Theology from women's experience. Until recently, it has been very hard to find this in most writings on Unitarianism, either in history or theology. If feminist theology is to do with both uncovering women's experiences and ideas, and also looking at the ways in which these have been suppressed, or look at the way we Unitarians have told our story and formed our theology, is a good place to start. If anyone is in doubt about the maleness of the picture of Unitarianism given by our historians, a glance at the indexes of works by Len Smith, Earl Morse Wilbur, or virtually any other standard text will show that Unitarian women are almost entirely absent. A history or theology of British Unitarianism which gives due weight to stories and agendas of anything other than male white ministers and a few influential lay men is a long way from a possibility at the moment. Before I identify a at least one subversive strand in this male picture, I'd like to indicate why history is an important field for feminist theology. As I've said, currently, the historical picture we are given is dominated by the stories and writings of men. Although the significance of this has not yet been studied in detail, I'd like to suggest the following observations. These literate men were generally educated in academic theology and biblical studies, and generally felt it necessary to define, promote, and develop Unitarianism primarily as a system of belief. Women, on the other hand, have until comparatively recently been excluded from formal theological education, either formally excluded or culturally excluded, and have generally shown less interest in the niceties of doctrine. Instead, they have been much more interested in praxis, the action part of the reflection-action process, and on religious practices. The way in which allegiance to a Unitarian community impacted on everyday life and social relations often differed according to gender. For example, it has been noted by feminist historians that particularly for middle-class women, church-related activities provided one of the few ways in which it was acceptable to have an agency which transcended the public-private split of Victorian society. The roles that women were able to play within Unitarian communities were historically very different from those taken by men. This gives women a different perspective on their faith. Feminist theology is concerned with showing how women have had a voice and an agency within their religious activities. So it is not sufficient just to add women's writings to the prevailing male story, as Len Smith suggested in his preface to his otherwise excellent short history of Unitarianism. I'd like to distinguish three ways for uncovering women's stories. Just uncovering stories and information about Unitarian women can be described as doing women's history. It adds women to the existing picture, but does not substantially change it. Doing feminist history involves developing methodologies which investigate the structures which have led to women's invisibility. And this becomes feminist theology when the structures under investigation are part of the beliefs and practices of a particular religion, in this case, Unitarianism. We should remember that now, and probably at most times in our history, our congregations are usually made up of more women than men. And yet, for the most part, we know very little of the thoughts, beliefs, and experiences of these women. And I want to draw attention to just one woman, one exceptional woman, of whom we have some evidence. Anna Letitia Barbauld is one of the 4 women named in the English Presbyterians by Gordon Bolam and others, which is one of the most comprehensive histories of British Unitarianism. A brief look at Anna Barbauld's life and works shows how she managed to claim a distinctive female voice in the prevailing male hegemony. Born in 1743, she was, of course, denied the formal education given to young men, but as her father was a Presbyterian minister, schoolmaster, and then tutor at Warrington Academy, she picked up more knowledge than most young women, and she was clearly very bright. She first became well known under her maiden name of Aikin as possibly the greatest woman poet of her day. Later, under her married name of Barbauld, she published more widely, firstly making a name for herself as a pioneer in early reading books and educational material, and then branching out into both politics and religion. And after the death of her husband, she earned a living by writing literary criticism and editing other authors' works. She died in 1825. Some say that she did more for women's rights than Mary Wollstonecraft, her contemporary and acquaintance. But in this paper, I'll concentrate mainly on her contribution to Unitarianism. In the late 18th and early 19th century, middle-class women were expected to confine themselves to the domestic sphere. It was certainly not done to speak in public, or certainly not to preach, though it was acceptable to teach young children and girls. Yet Barbauld has had a profound, though largely unacknowledged, influence on our British Unitarian movement. Her friendship and her correspondence with Joseph Priestley, one-time minister here, show their different approaches to religious matters. Priestley, as Barbauld wrote in a letter to her niece, followed the truth as a man who hawks follows his sport, at full speed, looking upward, and regardless into what difficulties the chase may lead him. Barbauld, on the other hand, placed more emphasis on training feelings and practicing a life of piety. Both took a lot of their theory from David Hartley's associationist psychology. In her influential Hymns in Prose for Children, published in 1781, Barbauld laid out her philosophy of religious education. She wrote, "The peculiar design of this publication is to impress devotional feelings as early as possible on the infant mind. Fully convinced as the author is that they cannot be impressed too soon, and that a child to feel the full force of the idea of God ought never to remember the time when he had no idea to impress them, by connecting religion with a variety of sensible objects, and with all that he sees, all that he hears, all that affects his young mind with wonder and delight, and thus by deep, strong, and permanent associations to lay the best foundations for practical devotion in future life. For he who has been early accustomed to see the Creator in the visible appearances of all around him, to feel his continued presence, and to lean upon his daily protection, though the religious ideas may be mixed with many improprieties, which his correct reason will refine away, has made large advances towards that habitual piety without which religion can scarce regulate the conduct and will never warm the heart. I should remind you that in 1781, he was used to include both men and women, and it is not unusual for women to write "we men," and this was quite acceptable and understood as meaning we humans at the time. It was only sometime in the 19th century when man was redefined to exclude women from having the vote. But as these hymns in prose were in regular use in Unitarian homes and Sunday schools for over 100 years, and were learnt by heart by a high proportion of Unitarians, including ministers such as James Martineau, who was quoted yesterday, their influence cannot be overestimated. Their inculcation of trust in a benevolent God mediated through family and nature, did much to bring warmth and sensibility into the cold rationality of priestlyite Unitarianism. Amongst her many religious writings, Barbault's thoughts on devotional tastes, on sects and on establishments is especially significant. In it, she makes a case for religion being not just a matter of searching for the truth, but also a matter of habit and taste. As she puts it, an affair of sentiment and feelings, in the sense it is properly called devotion. As you might imagine, this essay, published in 1775, was criticized by Priestley, and the two engaged in some prolonged discussions. Her opinion that disputes on religious subjects were detrimental to the operation of religious impressions was not accepted by Priestley, but it was very much the religion of William Gaskell of Cross Street Chapel much later in the 19th century. Barbauld summed up her position in a letter to Nicholas Clayton, writing, "Are philosophy and devotion then inconsistent? No, they are different views of the same subject. They require to be corrected by each other. The devotion of a mere philosopher will be cold. The religion of a mere pietist will be superstitious. But is it not owing to our imperfect natures that these two voices do not coalesce? I believe that it is, and that in another world, philosophy and devotion will be entirely the same thing." Barbauld's Unitarianism was not entirely a domestic affair. In spite of her gender, she managed to take part in the political struggle for religious liberty during her lifetime. Her reply to Gilbert Wakefield's inquiry into the expediency of public or social worship, she argued for the importance of public worship, stating, "Every time social worship is celebrated, it includes a virtual declaration of the rights of man." And she campaigned for the repeal of the Test Acts with an elegant and humorous pamphlet, As If from a Male Dissenter, originally published anonymously. Once her authorship became known, she was vilified as a virago, a fishwife, an unsexed female, and generally unwomanly. This lasted for a couple of years until Mary Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of women took the heat off Barbauld. Barbauld's fast day sermons, never preached by her, of course, but published anonymously, are said to be the only known examples of such sermons written by a woman. So how did Barbauld manage to be so influential and prolific in spite of the prevailing culture which severely restricted the public activities of respectable ladies? Firstly, she took great care to lead a decorous and respectable life, and to maintain her standing and that of her audience, her standing and also her audience within respectable society and within the rational dissenters. Secondly, especially early in her life, she used genres in which women's writing was accepted: poetry and educational matters, as well as letters. Letters were often passed round and were a sort of halfway house between being private and being public. Through the medium of poetry, she could then tackle what could be considered more masculine subjects, such as religion and politics, without usually creating too much antagonism, although it was a severe criticism of her poem criticizing the prevailing culture in the United Kingdom and hoping for better things in the United States that actually put an end to her publishing poetry. In religion, moral issues were considered acceptable subjects for women, and she would often take a moral or ethical viewpoint. In many of her writings, she uses domestic imagery to make religious and political points, thus blurring the boundary between feminine and masculine conventions. What is clear is that it was only Barbel's exceptional talent that allowed her to transcend the conventional barriers to women's participation in Unitarian public theology. But now I turn to more recent times, the early 1980s, which saw the start of overtly feminist Unitarian women's group and the production of Hymns for Living, the Green Hymn Book, which was the first denominational hymnal to take the issues of male language seriously and in a large part to use inclusive language. The first time the Unitarian General Assembly officially reacted to feminist theology was in 1982, when it passed a resolution to set up a working party to consider the possible implications of feminist theology in connection with the thought and worship of our denomination. The group was to consist of equal numbers of men and women and to produce a report by 1984. This was Growing Together, which is still available to download from the GA website. It has 7 main sections: women in society, language, images of God, our record, ministry, peace, and roles of women and men in the church. Several of the sections suggested consciousness-raising activities and group exercises, as well as essays, poems, and other short pieces. And its list of resources gave a fairly comprehensive guide to what was available in the early 1980s. Over 30 years later, it is easy to critique this report in the light of later developments. But as an initiative designed to stimulate members of Unitarian congregations, I think it was impressive. And the fact that it's still available is testimony either to its usefulness or to the lack of any further British Unitarian publication on the subject. I'll leave you to judge which. Its introduction reminds us of the affinities between feminist theology and Unitarianism. Both see religion in the context of our whole lives, and Unitarianism's free to search for truth enables us to pursue new insights. It describes feminist theology as working on 4 levels. Firstly, the individual as consciousness-raising, which it considers available to women only. Secondly, inclusive language in relation to both humans and God. Then it requires a deeper appreciation of what it calls feminine values and concepts. And lastly, is a process which must involve feeling, imagination, and activity, something which has to be done and experienced. Time limitations preclude a more detailed examination of Growing Together at this stage. Both feminist theology and Unitarianism have moved a great deal in the last 30 years. In general, within Christian circles, 1980s feminist theology was soon exposed as often claiming universal validity, while actually being based on the experiences of mainly middle-class, educated, white Western women. And much has been written since about the differing experiences of women in other contexts and the uncovering of complex and multiple practices of oppression. The development of both queer theory and post-colonial theory have helped in this process. As Marcella Althus-Reed and Lisa Isherwood say, at the Great Ecclesiastical Tea Party, men had by tradition organized the event, deciding who would make the tea, who would pour it, and who would receive it. When feminists came along with their disruptive gender questions, they insisted that they also could make and pour the tea. Queer theologians then came and uncovered the fact that feminists shared many assumptions with their male contenders about the essential rightness of things. Who decided that we should all be drinking tea? Growing together was rather limited in this respect, but in other places, Unitarian women began to be more adventurous, particularly in the case of worship. Even in the early 80s, some Unitarian women started setting their own agenda. At Golders Green Unitarians, in response to the minister's Lenten sermon series on feminist theology, taking themes from Women's Spirit Rising, an American anthology, the newly formed local Unitarian women's group declined the invitation to reply to specific sermons, that is, replying to the male agenda, and instead created their own agenda with a midsummer service based on feminist Wicca, with the congregation seated in a circle representing the wheel of the year, with a great deal of goddess imagery and the four directions honored and other traditional elements incorporated into recent women's experience. This wouldn't be very revolutionary now, but in 1981 or thereabouts, I don't think it had been done before in rational Unitarian congregations. However, this was so successful that the women were asked to do an annual service on similar lines for several years running after that. To what extent the Unitarian movement as a whole took on either the theological discussion or the practical implications of growing together is debatable. There is surely more awareness of gender, though not all have taken on board the need for inclusive language, especially in relation to divinity. Powerful committees are not always as balanced as they should be, and our reliance on readings and on authorities is often back to the male authorities. The importance of language, though, has remained crucial. If the divine, what is most important to us, however one describes it, is addressed and talked of in primarily male terms, here I'm thinking particularly of the Lord's Prayer, women are still seen as somehow inferior to men. Their self-esteem is damaged, and they may feel excluded from the worship or the religious activity. Although the term queer theology is not generally used within Unitarianism, our movement has made significant strides towards the recognition of gay men and lesbians. And of course, it's a pioneer at national and in many congregations of same-sex partnerships and equal marriage. is even beginning to explore issues related to transgendered people. But our theological thinking on this has been vague and unfocused, relying on the general principle of the worth of each human being. Celebrating diversity, the resource pack for Unitarian and Free Christian leaders on sexual orientation and other equality issues, the Pink Pack, was published by the GA in 2003. It includes a biblical reflection, but very little overt theology. In some respect, this mirrors what has happened to feminist theology in academia. In the late 1990s, feminist theology courses seemed to flourish. Even departments were established. But now the term is used much more rarely. Partly, this is due to the success of raising awareness, in that feminist considerations are now often found in more general biblical studies and in research methodology. In Luther King House, in the Educational Partnership, we started an MA module called Ministry in the Context of Feminist Perspectives in about 1999. This continued for under 10 years, and was then stopped on the understanding that feminist perspective should be in all taught modules. However, I rather doubt that this is the case. There's one particular aspect of methodology that I'd like to bring your attention: the importance of listening to those who are silenced, marginalized, or oppressed, for they know more than the dominant group. Bell Hooks, the American feminist, talks about this. She takes the example of the poor black worker. It was also used in connection with slavery. The poor person who works for the rich white person understands both their own lives in terms of their poverty, their living conditions, and also has to understand the mindset of the white master in order to serve them. So the poor worker has two different languages that they understand, in their own domestic situation and that of their employer, their master. Whereas the white master knows only their own way of living and is ignorant of the lived reality for the poor black servant. I'm wondering if one might apply this to some of the people in the British government, but I won't go there today. Another development in academic feminist theology is that it has broadened its scope to include non-Christian religions and issues of racism, post-colonialism, globalization, and so on. This is the line taken in Feminist Theology, the journal started in 1992 and still in existence. Although Unitarians have for a long time promoted interfaith dialogue and cooperation, and many have embraced non-Christian beliefs and practices, this has not usually been subject to feminist analysis. My impression is that much interfaith work is still dominated by the male hierarchy, especially when it involves church leaders. I remember an incident, or an occasion, when as General Assembly President in 2011, I attended such a gathering in London. Religious leaders coming together. After several speeches by various men, we were sent off in groups of a dozen or so for discussion. I was the only woman in my group. And to move things on from generalities like, we have our differences in belief and practices, but surely we share common ethics, I brought up our Unitarian promotion of same-sex partnerships. This certainly livened things up, as you might imagine. But the only person who came to my defense was the Orthodox Jewish leader, who said that while his organization disapproved of homosexuality, he saw recognizing its acceptance as valuable as a human right. The two areas in which there have been considerable development in feminist thought which bear investigation today are firstly gender issues and secondly eco-feminist theologies. Growing Together, in its section entitled What is Male, What is Female, gives exercises listing qualities such as gentleness, endurance, leadership, and various jobs, asking people to discuss whether they thought of them as male or female, and then discussing their findings. There was no discussion of the extent to which gender is a biological or a cultural product, except for a piece from Latin America, which begins, "For every woman that is tired of being a weak person when she knows she is strong, there is a man who is tired of looking strong when he feels vulnerable," and continues with similar contrasts. Later work has made a distinction between biological sex and cultural gender, and then gone on to problematize even this. Much has been made of subjectivity and agency, the extent to which a person feels recognized and empowered. And the emphasis is often on gendered subjects, that is, individual people in all their complexity. Some feminists have gone down the route of French thinkers like Irigaray, who have rejoiced in difference. However, on the whole, freeing gender from both biological essentialism and emphasis on categorization has allowed more detailed examination of the practices which lead to gendered and therefore oppressive cultures. For theologians, this can be developed to show how discriminatory practices can be modified in order to embody greater justice and love. Embodiment has been a continuing strand in feminist theology, as it does away with the old mind-body, spirit-flesh split, which leads to the men-women dualisms, with men definitely on top. And it grounds theological work in lived experience, with the body as a site of knowledge. And this in turn leads to a more holistic understanding of both theology and gender. One word which does not appear in Growing Together is sexuality. To some extent, this was rectified by our Celebrating Diversity Pack, but there is still work to be done, especially on the fluidity of both identity and sexuality. Growing Together also failed to encompass eco-feminist theologies. Since 1984, many people have become aware of the importance of the Earth's ecosystems and issues like global warming and its consequence. The theological assumptions which have played a significant part in this, like men being given domination over the earth, have also got some attention. But the connection to feminist concerns is not always recognized. Rooted in the lives of women who have experienced the effects of pollution, soil erosion, flooding, in addition to the usual discrimination within gendered cultures, work at the intersection of ecofeminism and religion has become increasingly important. The early religious assumption of affinity between women and nature and patriarchal domination of both carries on in many subtle ways, or not so subtle if we look at the current President of the United States. But the inadequacy of the stewardship model carries on this male model of dominance needs to be replaced by a more integrated models. As Lewis mentioned yesterday, the world as God's body, as developed by Grace Jansen and Sally McFaig, is one such possibility. A multidisciplinary approach is needed to uncover the complexity of interrelating issues. The concerns which have been most prevalent in feminist theology are especially relevant here. Embodiment, power with rather than power over, alternatives to violence. Surely war is one of the biggest polluters, as well as taking up vast amount of our resources and the occasion of much violence and rape against women. It may well be that the old emphasis on differences between men and women needs to be replaced by a more nuanced recognition of gendered subjects. But while women the world over continue to have a lesser status than men, to be poorer, even in this country, to bear the brunt of climate change, to suffer abuse and violence, the need to uncover the varied levels of discrimination and oppression characterized by patriarchal thinking and often pinned by religious beliefs and practices is still with us. I rest my case.
I invite now questions and comments to Anne. Marta.
Hi, you said my name, and I'm from New Unity, so I'm from the worship site where Mary Wollstonecraft was, and so I want to thank you first of all, because I think coming to Unitarianism, I was so excited about the birthplace of feminism and the fact that we ordained the first woman minister in the country. I think it's really, I found it easy to overlook the fact that we need still to think about the predominantly male history and legacy that we talk about. So thank you for pointing that out. My question to you, as a minister and former principal of a place that trains ministers, is can you speak to maybe the experience of being a female minister in the denomination?
I'll try. Thank you. When I first became a minister, round about 1/10 of our ministers were women. It's now, I think, just over 1/3. And at our annual ministers' conference, there are often more women than men, which says something about women's collegiality, I think. There's a bit about this which I wrote in a Lindsay Press publication a couple of years ago. As a minister, one is to some extent a public figure, so it's a question of holding in tension one's feminist sort of principles with ministering to everybody in the congregation, unfeminist men as well as feminist women and unfeminist women. So there is a sort of restraining influence that one's first duty is to minister to people in all their conditions, not to foist my agenda upon them. So one needs to be subtle. And of course the great temptation is to be co-opted into the establishments once you've sort of made it as a minister. But I was never the first woman minister in any of my 3 congregations. There'd always been one woman before me. I was the first woman principal, and it took me some time to discover my style of doing things differently. One thing which I did when it came to teaching Unitarian history was always ask my students to include some women's work in their writings, in the references, not to do an all-male story. That's quite hard because women's writings are not readily available and accessible, even with the internet. So it's been a balance, and I found myself extraordinarily inhibited as GA president when talking on behalf of all Unitarians, not to push my own agenda. And it's a constant battle, I think, between being a servant of the cause and speaking for other people, and trying to keep alive my own feminist consciousness. And there are times when my own feminist consciousness does get buried. So it's holding different things in tension. I hope that answers your question.
I was interested when you said that women are often, I think you said women are often more interested in praxis, and because I'm more interested in praxis. And then I wondered, what you thought of the extent to which feminist theology has influenced the way Unitarians worship and practice their faith.
I think we have moved a great deal. Of course, there are interesting questions about how you develop a balance. I mean, I noticed that Joe, in his, I found very moving worship, has used exclusively female sources. And maybe we need 100 years of that to balance the 200 years of the other. But there's been a lot of work done, and I think women who've been involved in the women's group, for example, and in feminist organizations outside Unitarianism have had quite an influence, as have those enlightened men who take it on board. And I think men can be in consciousness-raising groups and be aware of gender issues as well, although, of course, their experience is different. So we have moved enormously, but there is still, I think, an unconscious bias towards male authorities and male experience.
Ed Fordham from Chesterfield. In 2014, 136,000 people got married in a church. 46 of us were same-sex marriages, or more to the point, 23 same-sex marriages, couples. What advice would you give, or what opinion would you give, to the majority of Unitarian chapels that have not registered for same-sex marriages?
I'm very torn here. I can see the need for churches and congregations who do marriages, and not all do them, to be available for both heterosexual and same-sex ceremonies. And I think we can possibly give more help with the paperwork. We can also talk about the importance of respecting people in their own situations and so on. Even develop a theology of us all being in God's image if people want to use that sort of image. But there's a bit of me, that the old-fashioned second-wave feminist lesbian element, that is really sad to see that so much of the gay and lesbian community seems to have co-opted into a sort of imitation heterosexual marriage. And I really do think that there are many other ways of organizing relationships which might be a lot more appropriate and more justice-making. So I'm split by saying, yes, they ought to be available, but that's not the whole story.
I'm Moira from Cheltenham. So I would like to ask you, do you think a man in the Unitarian Church can be a feminist?
Well, of course, there are different definitions of feminists. A man can't have a woman's experience, but a man can be very sensitive to the issues. Liberation theology, with its option for the poor and the importance of listening to the disenfranchised, the poor and so on, is quite respectable. There are men who actually listen to women and take great care that their ministry, their talking, is sensitive to gender and other issues. So it depends how you're going to define feminist, but certainly men can be sensitive and can be. We need men to be very to promote the greater justice that this sensitivity gives.
Hi, it's me again. Susanna from Kensington Unitarians at the moment. Thank you for your talk, Anne. Particularly appreciated what you were saying about, speaking up for people who have been silenced historically. But I think there were some silence groups that you may have missed out, namely bisexual people and non-binary people, people who are, identify outside of the gender binary. And I really think if Unitarians want to move forwards, obviously same-sex marriage is a really important step that we've taken, but in terms of where society is at the moment, we're now kind of thinking beyond men and women and gender binaries.
Yes, I started to develop that and ran out of time, but yes, I would completely agree with you, which is why I talked about fluidity without actually naming. I should have named. Yes, so QTIA has now been added, hasn't it? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is more in terms of trans people, but what do you think can be done within the Unitarian movement to recognise more that there's more genders than just male and female?
I think we might take a look at what the Quakers have been doing, who are raising their consciousness on these issues, and I think maybe we need another pack, some work done on these issues and an exploration of both the theology and the practical implications of what this means. Basic things like arrangements of toilets and so on. Yes.
Philip Colfox, Bridport. You began to mention, or you sort of hinted possibly at the possibility. You mentioned you used the word nuanced and something else to do with how to celebrate our difference, the difference between the two sexes. So looking backwards, we've got a situation where women have been oppressed, definitely. But looking forward, can we celebrate our differences and make the most of it?
Again, there are two sides, at least two sides to the story. There's the fact that everybody is different, we all have different experiences, and on the whole, there are different experiences between men and women need to be encouraged to find safe spaces where those experiences can be reflected on and articulated still, and then shared more widely. But on the other hand, there is more. We have more in common than divides us. So I end up always trying to balance impossible things. But I don't think that we can enjoy what we have in common until we can express to ourselves, to others, our own particularities, whatever they may be. So we need both. I mean, one of the sad things of the last 30 years has been the loss of women's spaces in many ways. The heyday of the second wave feminism, there were women's consciousness raising groups, there were women-only groups. Our Women's League now quite often has men members, and they never discuss anything that men wouldn't feel comfortable hearing, which is why the women's group was started, which remains a women's space. In Manchester University, what was a feminist centre became a centre for gender studies, and the male voice started predominating. The one feminist research group open to women only was banned because they no longer allowed same-sex groups to meet on university premises. So there are very mixed messages. I think we still need same-sex groups, but we also need to come together. So yes, I want it all.